In the winter of 1964, the old Capuchin monastery of San Giovanni Rotondo decided to unseal a room that had been closed for decades. The place had no official name in the archives, yet among the monks it was whispered as the Room of Shadows, a chamber where forgotten documents rested under layers of dust and time. When the door creaked open, a stale breath of cold stone drifted out, carrying the scent of parchment and old secrets. On the lowest shelf, wrapped in brittle linen and darkened by age, they discovered a leather-bound dossier marked with a fading sigil, C47, Occultis. The binding cracked as they lifted it. Inside the front cover, an old superior had written a warning in small, slanted script, "Not for public release, for the study of souls only." The air in the room shifted. The monks knew immediately what this meant. Someone, decades earlier, had tried not to preserve this document but to bury it. When they opened the first page, the handwriting was unmistakable. These were the personal notes of Padre Pio, written in 1918, in the years when the world was still bleeding from war, and when whispers of the supernatural seemed to drift closer to the surface of ordinary life. His opening line was simple, but it carried a strange weight. "This is the account of the woman they brought to me, the one they called Agata." But the next line, underlined twice, chilled the monks deeper than the cold stone around them, and of the shadow that walked behind her. According to the letter attached to the file, Sister Agata came from a small convent near Foggia. The sisters there described her as quiet, obedient, gentle, a woman whose frail health had followed her since childhood. Nothing about her suggested danger or mystery, but the final months before her arrival told a different story, one that none of the nuns could explain. She had begun forgetting prayers she had known since her novitiate days. She shrank from holy water, as though it scalded her. Some nights, the sisters found her awake, kneeling on the floor of her cell, drawing strange symbols in a dusting of black ash, though no lamp, fire, or candle had been lit. The Mother Superior's letter ended with a single sentence: "Father, we fear what follows her is not illness." When Padre Pio received the request, he agreed to see her. In the margins of the document, he later confessed that before she ever arrived, he felt her presence. "I sensed her," he wrote, as though some premonition clung to the air itself. On the morning of the 7th of September 1918, the convent sent her to San Giovanni Rotondo. Fog covered the hills like a shroud, and the courtyard stones were still wet from the night's rain. Agata approached the monastery, supported by two sisters, with a local priest following closely behind, his face hollow with exhaustion. Padre Pio stood at the doorway as they entered, and in his notes he described that first moment with a precision that suggested both awe and dread. "I saw her silhouette, and behind her, a presence that did not belong to this earth." He did not call it a figure or a creature. Instead, he spoke of it as a distortion, something that resembled the shape of a person but lacked any true form. It moved when she moved, breathed when she breathed, as though tethered to her by some invisible thread. When Agata was guided into the small parlor room, she refused to lift her head. Her veil trembled, her fingers curled into the fabric of her sleeves as if she were gripping something no one else could see. At last she looked up. Padre Pio wrote that her eyes were dark, not the dark of color, but of depth, like staring into a dried-out well where the bottom had long vanished. The two sisters stepped back instinctively. The priest behind them clutched his rosary so tightly the beads cracked between his fingers. Agata whispered only one sentence, her voice thin and shaking: "Father, you should not come near me." But when Padre Pio stepped closer, her lips curved into a smile that did not belong to fear. A soft laugh slipped from her. The sound was wrong, layered, as if 2 or 3 different throats produced it at once. From that moment, the room changed. Something unseen thickened the air, as if the walls themselves were listening. Agata's every movement seemed pulled by an invisible weight, and when her gaze drifted toward the crucifix on the wall, she recoiled as though struck by a burning iron. Padre Pio wrote that the trembling in her hands did not come from illness, nor did the quiet muttering that escaped her lips from time to time. She whispered fragments of familiar prayers, then slipped into words that belonged to no language the monks recognized. But the phrase she repeated the most, almost inaudibly, was, "It came because I called. I didn't know. I didn't know." At that early stage, Padre Pio could not yet understand what she meant. The meaning would reveal itself later, in a way he would never forget. He ended the first section of his testimony with a simple, devastating sentence, the line that stunned the monks who unsealed the document nearly half a century later. The battle for her soul began the moment she crossed our threshold. Long before her arrival at San Giovanni Rotondo, Sister Agata was known throughout her small convent near Foggia as the quiet one, the gentle one, the woman whose frail body seemed to belong to suffering as naturally as a candle belongs to flame. Her fellow sisters often said she had the soul of a child and the endurance of a saint, for she never complained about the aching joints, the fevers, or the nights she spent coughing alone in her cell. She was the type of nun who prayed not with her lips, but with the softness of her life. Everything about her story should have ended there, in anonymity and devotion. Yet fate had placed a shadow on her path, one that no one in the convent recognized until it was too late. The first sign was small. She stumbled during evening prayer and forgot the second half of the Hail Mary, a prayer she had recited since childhood. The sisters thought exhaustion was to blame. They told her to rest, to sleep longer, to drink warm broth. But the next day, she forgot more, and the day after that, even more. Soon she could not finish a single prayer without freezing midway, staring into the air as if someone were whispering a different set of words into her ear. Then came the fear. Agata had once worn a small wooden crucifix beneath her habit, and she used to kiss it before sleeping. But one afternoon, as she reached for it, she recoiled violently and dropped it on the floor. Her hand shook as though she had touched a hot iron. The sisters found her in tears, unable to explain the terror clawing at her chest. Later that night, when a young novice sprinkled holy water over the dinner table as she did every evening, Agata jerked backward, her chair scraping against the stones with a sharp cry. Her skin reddened where the water touched her. It was then that the Mother Superior realized something deeper, something darker was at work. After midnight, the sisters discovered another disturbing sign. Agata was awake again, kneeling on the cold floor of her cell. She did not seem to notice the lantern light that flickered at her doorway. Her fingers traced symbols on the ground, circles within circles, jagged arrows, marks that resembled runes but belonged to no language from any book in their library. What chilled the sisters most was not the symbols themselves, but the material she used, a thin dust of black ash. There was no candle, no lamp, no source of fire anywhere near her. One sister whispered that it smelled faintly like burnt herbs. Another said it smelled more like something older, something that had no business inside a convent. Within a week, the Mother Superior could no longer deny what was unfolding before her eyes. She wrote to Padre Pio, detailing everything that had happened with careful, trembling precision. At the end of the letter, she added only one line: "Father, we fear that what afflicts Agata is not of this world." Padre Pio agreed to see her immediately. The morning they brought Agata to the Capuchin monastery was thick with fog. The women who escorted her two sisters and a local priest appeared almost ghost-like as they approached the courtyard. Agata walked between them, her steps slow and uncertain, like someone moving through a dream she could not wake from. Her veil clung to her face, and her breathing came in shallow bursts. It was not sickness, it was dread. Inside the sealed file, found decades later, Padre Pio described that moment with a clarity that left little room for doubt. He had been standing at the arched entrance of the monastery when he first set eyes on her. She did not look up, but he wrote that he felt something brush the edge of his spirit, like a cold wind that carried no air. Then, when she lifted her head slightly, he saw it. "I sensed a darkness standing behind her," he wrote. "It was shaped like a person but without a face. It clung to her like a second shadow." The two nuns holding Agata's arms had grown pale. They had not slept. The priest who followed behind them, his rosary wrapped tightly in his fist, walked as though every step added years to his life. They guided Agata into a small receiving room just past the entrance, a room meant for quiet conversations and confessions. That morning, it felt more like a chamber awaiting a verdict. Agata sat on a wooden chair near the wall. Her veil fell slightly to the side, revealing cheeks sunk from weeks of fear. She seemed to shrink into herself, but her hands, trembling, constantly moved against her habit as though brushing away invisible insects. The sisters tried to speak to her, but she turned her face away from the crucifix hanging above the door. Padre Pio approached her gently, careful not to alarm her, but when he stepped within a few feet, Agata's breath hitched. She raised her head with slow, unnatural precision. Her eyes met his. He later wrote that her gaze was so dark it seemed bottomless, not merely black but empty, like staring into an unlit cavern where sound itself died. In that moment, the room felt colder. Even the lantern flame on the table flickered, bending as though pulled by an unseen breath. Agata spoke for the first time since her arrival. Her voice was small but trembling, stretched tight like a string about to snap. "Father, you should not come near me." The sisters froze. The priest took a step back. Padre Pio, however, remained where he was. And then it happened. Agata's lips parted. The expression on her face shifted not to fear, but to something disturbingly close to amusement. A low, layered laugh escaped her. It was not one voice but two or three intertwined, as though something inside her found humor in the moment. Her hands twitched. Her shoulders jerked. The atmosphere thickened again, the room swallowing sound like a closed tomb. Padre Pio wrote that he knew, even before she spoke again, that this was no ordinary affliction. She did not come alone, he wrote. Something had followed her, something that believed it had a claim on her soul. At that moment, the real mystery of Agata began, and whatever walked behind her was only just beginning to reveal itself. The room where they brought Agata was small, almost bare, with the faint scent of candle wax lingering in the corners. It was the kind of space meant for quiet confessions and simple conversations. But as soon as she crossed the threshold, the air thickened in a way no one could explain. Even the two nuns who had accompanied her found themselves stepping backward, as though some instinct warned them to keep distance. Padre Pio entered last. He closed the door gently behind him, and the muted click of the latch echoed far louder than it should have. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching Agata. She sat hunched on a wooden chair, her hands shaking, her veil slightly askew from the long journey. She looked small, fragile, almost ghost-like. But there was something else, a heaviness, a tension, a feeling that the space around her was warped by something unseen. He took a step forward. The instant he moved, Agata reacted. Her chin lifted with unsettling slowness, as if someone else were pulling invisible strings beneath her skin. Her face tilted upward until her gaze met his. Padre Pio later wrote that he had never seen eyes like hers that day. They were dark, not simply in color, but in depth. They looked as though they had swallowed light, as though they were not eyes at all, but openings into something bottomless. "When I stepped closer," he wrote, "she raised her head, and her eyes were black, deep as though without a flaw. The presence I saw in them was not human." The words captured only a fraction of what he felt. He would explain later that it was not merely the darkness in her gaze, it was the sensation that something behind those eyes was watching him, studying him, waiting for him to make the next move. Agata did not blink. Her breathing grew slow and deliberate, as though she were adjusting to some rhythm that no one else could hear. Padre Pio called her name once, then twice. She did not respond. The nuns clasped their rosaries and whispered prayers under their breath. Then, at last, she spoke. The words were simple, ordinary, even, but the way they fell from her lips made the sisters shudder. "Father," she whispered, "you should not come near me." It was the only sentence she would speak for nearly an hour. Her voice trembled, but not from fear. There was a strange, restrained urgency to it, like someone trapped behind a wall, banging from the other side, trying to warn him. And yet the lips that spoke those words seemed unfamiliar, as though they were not entirely her own. Padre Pio stepped closer, despite the warning. Her eyes tracked the movement, but her body remained perfectly still, frozen in that unnatural rigidity. There was something profoundly wrong about the way she sat, too composed, too measured, like a statue momentarily animated. He sensed the tension before anything happened. He later noted in his report that the air felt charged, like the atmosphere before lightning strikes. Then, without any sign of transition, Agata's features twisted. Her mouth stretched into a smile, not a gentle or nervous smile, but something wide and unnatural, as though the muscles were being pulled from the inside. And she laughed. It was a sound no one in the room ever forgot. The laugh came out layered, as if several voices were attempting to speak through the same throat at once. One was high and sharp, another low and rumbling like distant thunder, and yet a third seemed almost whisper-like, coiling around the others. The tones clashed and blended in a way that made the hair on the back of every neck stand up. The young nun closest to her gasped and stumbled backward, knocking over a small stool. The priest beside her muttered a prayer so rapidly that his words dissolved into panicked breath. Even Padre Pio felt a coldness crawl up his spine, a sensation not of fear, but of deep sorrow, as if something in the room rejoiced in despair. Agata's head tilted to the side, and her smile widened further. The laugh grew louder, echoing in the small chamber. Her shoulders trembled, though whether from strain or mockery was impossible to tell. The sound seemed to fill the very walls, pressing inward until the sisters felt as though the whole room were shivering. When the laughter stopped, it ended abruptly, like a door slamming shut. The silence afterward felt unnatural, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Agata's expression emptied, her smile vanished. Her eyes closed for a brief moment, too brief for rest, and when she opened them again, the darkness inside them had deepened, as though something had settled in. Padre Pio recorded that the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The lantern flame flickered, wavering sideways as if pushed by an invisible wind. He sensed that whatever had laughed was still close, still present, and still testing him. He called her name again, Agata, look at me. But when she lifted her face this time, it was not recognition he saw. It was an emptiness so profound that he felt, for the first time in years, the weight of something trying to press against his spirit, something that wished to be acknowledged. For a long moment, no one spoke. The sisters remained near the door, gripping each other's arms. The priest's hand shook so violently that the rosary beads clicked together like teeth. Padre Pio was the only one who moved, stepping carefully toward her, though each footfall felt heavier than the last. He would later write that he sensed two beings in that room, the frightened woman who had whispered the warning, and the thing that had laughed through her. They were not the same. The next minutes passed in tense silence. Agata stared ahead, unblinking, her chest rising and falling with a stiff, unnatural rhythm. Anyone who looked at her too long felt as though they were standing on the edge of a deep well, waiting to fall in. Padre Pio closed his eyes and prayed softly, calling on the names of saints and angels. And then, as he finished the final line of a short prayer, Agata's lips twitched again, as if something inside her had heard him. The darkness in the room shifted, and the true confrontation had only just begun. Padre Pio later wrote that the moment felt like stepping across an invisible threshold. One instant, he was standing before an afflicted young woman, trembling and bound to a chair. The next, he was standing before something else, something that occupied the same body but did not belong to it. The air thickened, heavy with an oppressive stillness, as though the monastery itself was bracing for what was about to unfold. He approached her slowly, his fingers wrapped tightly around the crucifix. Her head hung low, hair draped over her face in a dark curtain. The only movement came from her shallow, trembling breaths. The candles guttered as though exhaling their final light. He spoke first, his voice steady. "Who are you, tormenting this soul?" The answer came not from Agata's lips, but from a voice that seemed to slip out from beneath her, around her, and through her, layered, unsteady, shifting like smoke caught in a draught. "Me," it said. "I am merely here to collect what was promised." Padre Pio felt a chill crawl down his spine, but he refused to let it settle in his heart. "No one belongs to you," he replied firmly. "All souls belong to God." A low, amused hum vibrated through the room. Then the entity answered, almost tenderly, as though it were consoling a naive child. "You know so little, stigmatic monk." She called to me. In the night, she begged for healing. I am only repaying her plea. The implication hung in the air like a bitter incense. Padre Pio did not flinch. "Deception is your nature," he said, tightening his grip on the crucifix. "Every word you speak is poison." A distorted chuckle rose from Agata's throat, wrong, doubled, as if 2 or 3 dissonant voices were attempting to overlap. "Deception?" the presence repeated. "Your kind taught her fear, fear of darkness, fear of failure, fear of the God she prays to, and it was through that fear that she opened the door to me." At that moment, all the candles went out at once. The darkness did not simply fall, it slammed into the room like a weight. Padre Pio later described it as a sudden suffocation of light, as if invisible claws had swiped through the flames. The silence that followed was so absolute, it seemed to press against his eardrums, yet he could still sense the entity like a cold breath against the nape of his neck. He took one slow step forward, refusing to surrender to the suffocating dread. "Clarissa, Agata," he said gently, using the name she had been given at baptism. "Do you hear me? Do you want to be free?" For a long moment there was nothing. No sound, No movement. Then a faint trembling passed through her arms, her fingers twitching as if reaching out for something far away. When she finally spoke, it was her real voice, thin, fragile, soaked in terror. "Father, help me. I don't want to go with it." But the moment the words left her mouth, her face twisted violently. Her neck jerked back as if seized by invisible hands. The darkness in her eyes returned, swallowing the human warmth like ink spreading across water. And then the entity spoke again, its tone no longer mocking but cold and triumphant. "Too late, stigmatic. She belongs to me." Padre Pio felt the force of those words like a blow to the chest, but something inside him ignited an unwavering certainty that no soul was beyond redemption. He knelt beside her, raising the crucifix before him. "What binds her is not ownership," he said slowly, "but fear, and fear has no authority here." The entity let out a slow, simmering hiss. "You think you can claim her back? You think your prayers can sever what she offered freely?" She called into the dark. And the dark answered. "God answers too," Padre Pio replied. "Always." A violent tremor rippled through Agata's body. Her shoulders jerked against the straps, her teeth clattering in a sickening rhythm. The chair beneath her creaked under the strain. The temperature in the room plummeted so sharply that Padre Pio could see his own breath clouding before him. He continued anyway, raising his voice slightly. "You lie to her. You cling to the wound in her heart, not her soul." The presence growled an animalistic sound that did not belong within human lungs. She prayed to anything that would listen. "I listened, and twisted her suffering into bondage," Padre Pio replied. "That is not a vow, that is extortion." The shadows around them pulsed faintly, like a living creature reacting to pain. Agata suddenly inhaled sharply, a choked gasp that sounded like she was drowning on air. In those brief seconds, her true self surfaced again, eyes wide, pleading, desperate. Her lips trembled as though trying to form words. He leaned closer. "Child, speak if you can. I am here." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Father, please, don't let it take me." Her face contorted violently again, the invasion reclaiming her, twisting her expression into something grotesque and hollow. Her mouth stretched in a terrible grin, too wide, too mechanical to be human. "You hear her," the presence said. "She knows she belongs to me." Padre Pio's heart broke at the cruelty behind the words, but he did not waver. "You have no claim over a soul created by God. I command you, let her speak." The entity's voice deepened, becoming more resonant, as though something ancient was pushing through her fragile frame. She gave herself. "I take what is freely offered." "No," Padre Pio said sharply. She cried, from despair, not consent. Silence followed, long, heavy, dangerous. Then the presence whispered, "She fears him. She always has. You taught her that fear. You planted the seed. I only harvested it." The accusation struck like a blade, but Padre Pio knew its purpose, to break his resolve, to make him doubt the very faith that sustained him. "Fear is not faith," he replied calmly, "and the God she fears is a God who loves her still." The darkness recoiled, as if burned. Then, with a sudden burst of fury, Agata's entire body arched off the chair. Her hands clawed at the empty air, nails scraping against nothing. Her head jerked to the side with enough force that Padre Pio feared her neck might snap. He stepped forward, pressed the crucifix to her forehead, and commanded, "In the name of Christ, be silent." A shriek erupted so sharp it seemed to crack the air. It was not the cry of Agata, but of something being forced backward, inch by inch. She collapsed against the chair, chest heaving. For a moment, the room was quiet. Padre Pio looked into her trembling eyes and saw only one thing: fear fighting to become hope. He whispered, "You are not lost. You hear me? You are not lost." Well, but deep in the corner of the room, where the darkness seemed unnaturally thick, a voice murmured one final time, "This is not over." The prayer had settled into a steady rhythm, echoing softly against the cold stone walls. Padre Pio had entered a state of deep focus, each word falling from his lips with the weight of an ancient truth. Yet something within him stirred a quiet, insistent tug, like a whisper at the edge of his consciousness. He did not fully understand why he felt compelled to ask, but he obeyed the prompting without hesitation. "Agata," he said, his voice low but firm, "what did you promise?" The air shifted instantly. It was as if his question had pierced a hidden membrane, triggering a reaction neither he nor the room itself could ignore. The candles flickered violently, bending backward as though pushed by an unseen wind. A dense cold crept across the floor, wrapping around the legs of the wooden chair on which Agata sat bound. Then came the laugh. It started as a faint vibration, barely audible, like a distant chuckle leaking through a crack in reality. But it grew, expanding outward, bouncing from wall to wall in ways no natural voice could. It did not come from Agata's mouth. It did not even come from her body. It came from the very stone around them, as though the monastery itself had momentarily become a conduit for something ancient and mocking. Finally, the presence spoke, its voice drifting from the darkness behind Padre Pio rather than from the trembling woman before him. A small prayer, it purred, so small yet so precious. She begged, "If anyone can save my mother from dying, I offer my soul to whoever hears me." "I merely," answered. The last word slithered through the room, stretching itself along the walls like oil on water. Padre Pio felt a chill at the base of his neck, not fear, but the sorrow of recognition, despair, bargaining, a plea fueled not by sin, but by heartbreak. Agata began to sob, not the distorted wail that came from her earlier, but a true human cry, raw, trembling, filled with shame and confusion. Tears streamed down her cheeks in uneven paths. She tried to raise her hands to wipe them away, but the bindings held her fast, and then her arms jerked backward. The force was sudden and brutal. Her wrists strained against the leather straps as if invisible hands were wrenching them behind the chair. Her shoulders twisted unnaturally, and she cried out in pain, not spiritual torment this time, but the unmistakable agony of her flesh being pulled to its limits. Padre Pio rushed forward, gripping her forearm to keep it from dislocating. Her skin was icy. Her muscles clenched so tightly they felt like stone beneath his fingers. He placed his other hand on her shoulder, trying to steady her shaking body. "Agata," he said softly, "you are not alone." But the presence was not done. From the far corner of the room, a voice whispered, not loud, but sharp enough to feel like a physical cut. She wept over her dying mother. She begged the darkness for mercy. And I, unlike your silent heaven, listened. Padre Pio's jaw tightened. Despair is not a covenant. A terrified plea is not consent. The entity hissed, a sound like steam escaping from cracked granite, but she believed it was. She believed she had given herself away. And belief, it said slowly, is all I need. As Berry greet, Padre Pio took a deep breath and placed a trembling hand over Agata's heart. Beneath his palm, her heartbeat raced, like a frightened bird trapped in a storm. "You hold her despair," he murmured, "not her soul." As soon as he spoke those words, the room changed. A low rumble passed through the floor, vibrating up through the wooden chair. The shadows in the corners pulsed, pulling back and then pushing forward as if fighting some invisible tide. The air grew heavy, pressing down on Padre Pio's shoulders until it felt like he carried a weight twice his size. Agata's face twisted with anguish, her eyes closed tight, her lips mouthing silent words of apology, regret, fear. "I didn't know," she whispered faintly. "I didn't know anyone else could hear me." Her voice broke, collapsing into another sob. "I was so scared. I didn't want to lose her. I didn't mean to." Before she could finish, her head snapped backward. Her mouth opened in a silent scream as the presence surged outward again. "Regret changes nothing," it growled. She spoke. She offered. "She is mine." Padre Pio rose to his feet and positioned himself directly between the entity and the trembling girl. He held the crucifix before him, its worn edges glinting faintly even in the dim light. "You cannot claim what God has already claimed," he said. The entity laughed again, short, sharp, bitter. "God did not come for her that night," it snarled. "I did." Padre Pio did not blink. And yet here she sits, still reaching for him. He lowered the crucifix until it was inches from Agata's forehead. A thin wisp of smoke curled upward from her skin, not from burning, but from the presence recoiling violently within her. "No darkness," he said, "can own a soul that still cries out for light." The shadows recoiled again. The temperature rose by a single, almost imperceptible degree. Then, for the first time since the encounter began, the presence hesitated. The silence that followed felt like the world holding its breath. Agata's hands, though bound, shifted slightly, her fingers curling inward as if in prayer. Tears still streaked her cheeks, but something new flickered behind them, a faint spark of hope, and it was enough. The entity retreated, not with a scream, but with a slow, resentful hum, like an animal backing away while keeping its eyes locked on its prey. It did not leave. Padre Pio could still sense it, but it loosened its grip. Agata sagged forward, exhausted, her forehead coming to rest against Padre Pio's hand. She whispered a single phrase, barely audible. "It's slipping." Padre Pio bowed his head, whispering a prayer over her trembling form. He wrote later in the file, "I understood then that the darkness held her through despair, not through any true claim. And despair, once exposed to hope, begins to lose its power." Well, but deep in the corner of the room, where the darkness seemed unnaturally thick, a voice murmured one final time, "This is not over." The moment Padre Pio placed his stigmata-marked hand upon Agata's head, the atmosphere in the small confessional chamber changed with frightening immediacy. The candles did not flicker, they simply flattened, as if some unseen pressure pressed the flames downward. His notes record that the temperature fell so abruptly that my breath turned to mist before my eyes, and at the same instant, Agata's pupils drained of color. Her eyes became a cloudy, milky white, not bright like blindness, but obscured as though smoke curled behind the surface of her gaze. Padre Pio began the invocation of Street, Michael the Archangel, his voice steady though the air vibrated with a low, guttural growl that did not come from Agata's lips, but from somewhere behind her, or above her, or perhaps from inside the walls themselves. She trembled under his hand, not resisting but jerking like a marionette pulled by frantic, hostile strings. When he reached the words, "Cast it away by the power of God," Agata's body arched with such violence that her hair snapped across her face like a whip. What came out of her throat was not a scream but a shriek, layered with several voices, some deep, some shrill, some echoing as though shouted down a cavern. It was not human, not even animal, but something that seemed to claw backward through time itself. Then everything stopped. Agata dropped to the floor as though a wire suspending her had been severed. The sound of her body hitting the stone echoed unnaturally long, as if the room were far larger than it truly was. Padre Pio felt a sudden gust of heat, followed by a sharp, acrid smell, sulfur mixed with something faintly metallic, like scorched iron. He described it later as the odor of something that was never meant to breathe our air. Behind Agata, in the small wedge of darkness cast by the corner of the room, something shifted. Only once. A ripple, thin as a shadow under water, broke apart and dissolved into nothing, like ash scattered by an unseen wind. Padre Pio knelt beside her, continuing the prayer even after the silence returned, even after the heaviness in the air lifted. He prayed until his voice grew hoarse and the cold receded from the stones beneath his knees. Nearly 3 hours passed before the girl finally opened her eyes. Their color had returned, soft brown, trembling but undeniably her own. She looked around as if waking from a long and violent storm. Her lips parted. For a moment she could not speak, and Padre Pio feared the entity had left her damaged or mute. But at last, in a whisper so light he had to lean close to hear it, she said, "I heard it leave." Nothing more. Just that single sentence, fragile, exhausted, but unmistakably free. In the final lines of the sealed report, Padre Pio's handwriting grows steadier, as though he wished to leave no room for misinterpretation. He wrote that evil does not storm the soul like a conquering army. It waits at the threshold where human despair thins the walls of the heart. The devil, he concluded, does not seize. The soul man offers the opening through which it enters. Yet a single spark of hope is enough to strip it of its claim. Backscene. He reflected briefly on Agata's ordeal, noting that the entity had not bound itself to her through a pact of will, but through the frailty of fear. The girl had cried out into the darkness, believing no one else could save her, and in that cry she left a door ajar. Padre Pio emphasized that this is the oldest deception, that despair is the end of God's reach. It is not. Even the weakest plea for mercy, he wrote, lights a path the enemy cannot endure. The monastery later sealed the document, marked C-47, Occultis, placing it deep within the restricted archives. For more than 40 years, it remained untouched, referenced only in whispers among a few senior friars. What made it exceptional was not merely the violence of the possession, but the clarity and completeness of the account. A direct conversation between Padre Pio and a malignant spirit, recorded in his own hand, witnessed by others present in the chamber. He ended his report with a final reflection, almost a warning. Where despair begins, temptation speaks. Where hope persists, even faintly, the shadows retreat. It was the closest he came to summarizing the battle that unfolded that night, one fought not over a body, but over belief itself. The entity laughed again, short, sharp, bitter. God did not come for her that night, it snarled. I did. Padre Pio did not blink, and yet here she sits, still reaching for him. He lowered the crucifix until it was inches from Agata's forehead. A thin wisp of smoke curled upward from her skin, not from burning, but from the presence recoiling violently within her. No darkness, he said, can own a soul that still cries out for light. The shadows recoiled again. The temperature rose by a single, almost imperceptible degree. Then, for the first time since the encounter began, the presence hesitated. The silence that followed felt like the world holding its breath. Agata's hands, though bound, shifted slightly, her fingers curling inward as if in prayer. Tears still streaked her cheeks, but something new flickered behind them, a faint spark of hope, and it was enough. The entity retreated, not with a scream, but with a slow, resentful hum, like an animal backing away while keeping its eyes locked on its prey. It did not leave. Padre Pio could still sense it, but it loosened its grip. Agata sagged forward, exhausted, her forehead coming to rest against Padre Pio's hand. She whispered a single phrase, barely audible. It's slipping. Padre Pio bowed his head, whispering a prayer over her trembling form. He wrote later in the file, I understood then that the darkness held her through despair, not through any true claim. And despair, once exposed to hope, begins to lose its power. Well, but deep in the corner of the room, where the darkness seemed unnaturally thick, a voice murmured one final time, This is not over.